Hey there folks, the number one Squid fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Squid record, Cowards. Look, it isn't any sort of secret that Squid are frequently listed behind some of their windmill scene peers when it comes to the topic of contemporary British experimental rock bands, a topic that, as I am sure you are aware, comes up in conversations at parties and family gatherings very frequently. At least that's what I assume. I'm not invited to parties, or family gatherings for that matter, but I digress. Black Country New Road have the kind of dramatic history that kind of cements them as future alternative music legends already. Bands like Dry Cleaning have pretty consistently remained popular and relevant with their own unique brands. Jordy Greep's cult-like fanbase has only grown since he initially departed the equally beloved Black Midi with their breakup, and even some more recent bands like English Teacher have eclipsed Squid in terms of both acclaim and commercial success alike, which kind of makes one wonder, where is Squid in the middle of all of this? And honestly, it's kind of not hard to see why that remains true with a record like Cowards, but I really don't mean that in a bad way at all. This is a continuation of 2023's Oh Monolith, sonically speaking, a record that continues to go in that album's artsier direction after their 2021 debut, Bright Green Field, and its more post-punk oriented sort of sound, and now their latest effort feels like Squid's most nuanced and at times most inaccessible record to date, an album that will likely drive away some pre-established fans, but hopefully attract some new ones as well. I mean, I genuinely do think that this is their most ambitious and to an equal extent creatively successful in terms of execution of ideas record to date. The experimental punk origins of the band have practically vanished at this point, at least for the most part. They are certainly not as significant as they once were a handful of years ago, and that will fairly understandably come as a point of criticism for some. I mean, not for nothing, but they did pretty much establish a fan base based off of the initial hype several years ago that they found with Bright Green Field, and the deranged post-punk kind of sound of tracks like Narrator, for example, arguably still their most popular song to date, and the more methodical and frequently just outright atmospheric tracks and instrumentals on this record may not necessarily strike a chord with that same audience. And I'm not necessarily saying that that's a mistake on Squid's part, because obviously the only mistake they could really make is not doing what they wanted creatively, but I do think it definitely will drive away some people from giving this record a fair shake, or at least appreciating this record for what it is. Again, a slower and at times more emotionally intense take on what Squid is capable of. I mean, the band's dive into the more progressive and art school type of territory that's being put on display here, it really doesn't cause them to lose their spark or anything like that, which is certainly an understandable fear when it comes to a record like this that somewhat heavily changes up the sound that a band has established for themselves in the past, despite, again, their previous record definitely going in a more kind of jazz-oriented and jam-oriented direction than their debut. But nonetheless, I digress. Cowards manages to really highlight just how great Squid can be when they mostly stray away from their punk-adjacent origins and pick up a more compositional style that's not too terribly dissimilar from bands like Noi and Soft Machine, among other European experimental groups rooted in jazz and, at some points, even electronic music. As a whole, I think it makes for a sound that is wildly interesting and, at times, downright completely unique from anything else going on within the quote-unquote windmill scene right now. I mean, I don't necessarily think that Squid are the best band to come from that venue and from that scene, but at the same time, I definitely can pretty confidently say, with this record at least, that they don't sound like any other band coming out of it right now, and no other band sounds like them, and that certainly is never really a bad thing. Memorability is really the best thing a band can have at the end of the day. Cowards could, in theory, be viewed as a bit of a slow burn listening experience, so to speak, and songs like the title track, as well as the album closer, Well Met, Fingers Through the Fence, kind of prove that. I mean, they're slow, they're nearly mathematical at times in the way that the band perfectly land every single beat in these odd time signatures that pop up now and again. It all really just comes together to be a slow and at times nearly disintegrating kind of listening experience that, more than anything, highlights the technical ability of Squid arguably more than they ever have had the chance to be seen before, which is really nice to see, considering that Squid have always been a pretty intense band from an instrumental perspective, and no matter how they're presenting it, whether it's in a more manic and chaotic kind of way, or in a more slower and again more methodical kind of way like they are here, it's really nice to see that instrumental integrity being really put out into the spotlight in a new and interesting way. I mean, Squid is packed with talented musicians who manage to distinguish themselves from one another while at the same time having enough interplay that they really do feel like a singular unit. Though, with that being said, I do think that an extra degree of credit should be given to Ollie Judge here, functioning as the band's drummer as well as primary vocalist. I mean, his double timing here is just nothing short of impressive, and that is especially true when you consider that the band has regularly been approaching jazzy time signatures with increasing frequency over the course of their past couple of albums. I just think it's worth mentioning him in particular and singling him out as a driving force as to how impressive Squid can be in their best moments, such as pretty much every track on this record, for example. That especially rings true when you consider that his vocal work here is as charismatic as ever, albeit significantly more laid back than what a listener could have expected just a few years ago. Certainly, the band is in a different creative mode now than they were then, as one would expect with nearly half a decade having passed since Bright Green Field, but I digress. As Squid continue to lean into their more complex and at times tonally, sonically sedate influences, their compositional talents are also shown off a lot more than they ever really had the chance to demonstrate in the past for the most part, outside of a couple longer tracks on their first two records, but nonetheless, subtle key changes, tight rhythms, well-timed additions of embellishments that range from horns to trippy layered guitars that give off a sort of neo-psych feel at times, albeit a sort of underlying tone that never overtakes the record at any moment. It makes what could have been a totally uneventful and painfully slow, sluggish kind of record into something that's consistently engaging and truly legitimately psychedelic in some of its best and most grandiose moments. I mean, the entire record just feels like a well-improvised jam session that was edited down to its better moments, and then some solid songwriting was sprinkled on top of it, and I mean, that's really the best way I could describe this record as a whole. Even beyond the aforementioned post-rock influences here, and how they combine with some of the post-punk and krautrocky sounds that Squid have pretty much always worked with since the beginning of their career, I do think there are various moments throughout the entirety of Cowards that see new ideas be introduced to the band's repertoire that continue to help them differentiate themselves from their peers, which is something that felt like a bit of a flaw of the band on their debut, and something that they heavily improved upon with their sophomore effort, thus leading this album to feel like a natural bit of evolution for them in terms of sheer creativity and artistic ambition. I mean, the Baroque harpsichord on Fieldworks 1 makes for a remarkably atmospheric cut, despite it being the shortest song here by pretty much a mile, while its sister song Fieldworks 2 provides one of the more dramatic soundscapes of Squid's career thus far, kind of resulting in a track that feels almost kind of classic 80s stadium rocky, but with a much more overdramatic and at times emotional appeal to it. And I don't mean overdramatic or overly emotional in a bad way. It's a moving track for sure, and it's interesting to see Squid put out something that feels so earnest and so quote-unquote normal at the same time. It's certainly an interesting song and one of my favorites here, and even beyond that, there's a number of light electronic influences on tracks like the album opener Crispy Skin, which has rightfully been recognized by a lot of people as one of the best songs here. And it also really is worth noting that Cowards, despite being a very ambitious project, never fully leaves the creative grounds that made Squid so appealing to people in the first place when they started gaining traction at the beginning of the decade. I mean, in particular, the track Showtime, again, one of the highlights of the record for me, it really embraces the sort of post-punk sound that has always defined them at their core, no matter what direction they've gone in stylistically speaking, the sound that they've basically become known for over the years, while also having several passages that kind of dwell on the more electronic side of things. And I think that it's really nice to see a song, and several other tracks on this record for that matter, that manage to kind of take what makes Squid at their core Squid, and allow various different ideas to kind of be wrapped around that, not really betraying Squid's origins, while at the same time managing to go in a new direction creatively creatively and not treading over old ideas. I think it makes for a record that comes across as deeply honest, even when it's at its most dense lyrically and compositionally, and the final result is an album that feels both entirely fresh and comfortably familiar for Squid, and people like myself who are pretty willing to see where the band are going in the future while also hoping that they never really stray too terribly far away from what makes them such an effective band in the first place. It has genuinely been a wonder to see Squid evolve from a band with a large pool of potential and yet a relatively indistinct creative identity to a band that have fully capitalized on their own artistic desires and have become something uniquely their own in the process, while never really sacrificing any sense of earnesty. I mean, really, despite drawing influences from a plethora of different places throughout this record, Cowards may be the single most unique project that Squid have put out to date. I mean, it's too post-rock to be post-punk. It's more electronic than most krautrock actually is in the modern day. It's too punk to be prog or prog adjacent at times. I mean, as a whole, it's just Squid. And that's all it really needs to be at the end of the day. And not only is it just Squid, but it's Squid at their best, in my opinion. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. Thanks for watching the Infinite Jukebox, and I'll see you in the next one.